Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Hey, Dan. Welcome back.
You know what I love to think about in December? I love to think about warm weather and flowers.
Yeah, especially when it's cold and rainy. I like snow and I like bright, sunshiny, cold days. But when it's cold and it's raining, that's not my favorite time of year. In fact, that's probably why I don't do much field work anymore.
I know. And the thing is, it hasn't been excessively cold, but it really hasn't been too warm either. And it's been very wet, which is kind of typical anymore.
Yeah.
That's not an abnormality anymore. That's just the standard. But that's a whole other show. And
yeah, there's truth for that. As you're getting into the winter and you're starting to think about spring and you're thinking about, okay, when do I need to treat for what? Especially for orchard owners, one of the things you can do is go on to Cornell's growing degree calculator. So if you search for Cornell growing degree calculator, it'll come up, but it's called NEWA, N-E-W-A. And this is a great site because it utilizes the weather stations all across the East Coast. So if you're out in the Midwest listening, it's not really going to be as helpful for you. But what it does is it takes the growing conditions and the number of growing degree days, which is the number of days it takes for an insect or a disease to become active. Once they're above a certain temperature for a certain number of days, it all accumulates. And once they reach that magical number, that's when they become active. And so by utilizing the NEWA website, it will help you predict when you should be spraying to accurately impact the pests that you're trying to impact. And one of the things that you want to do also is to recognize what you should be using when to help protect the bees.
That's right, Karen. That growing degree days calendar is a wonderful tool. And there is one from Ohio State.
Well, a lot of these calculators are cumulative from multiple universities, like West Virginia University plays into the NEWA one at Cornell. So we feed them our information, and Dr. Rahman at West Virginia University Extension has coordinated with them quite a bit in doing research projects to help make sure they're accurate. And so they are definitely cumulative efforts and cooperative efforts. So it's not necessarily Cornell that's doing all the work, but there are other institutions that are feeding into these calculators. But they're really handy.
One from Michigan State that I saw, I really liked. I thought it was very simple to use. Showed you the pest, showed you the picture. But unlike Karen, I am in the Midwest. and Michigan State is also in the Midwest. So
yep. And we do have listeners in Michigan. We got contacted a little while back from someone from up in Michigan. So hi Michigan.
Well, that's all right. That's enough Michigan talk for the day. But all right. So the point that we're getting at is a great way to identify pests, to manage pests, is identification of pests, and a great way to identify pests, or at least anticipate a pest problem, is to utilize that growing degree days. People use it for corn. For corn, it revolutionized the way we grow corn, because the tasseling, the silking, how much it's going to grow, harvest time, it's so precise in managing crops. And it's also very precise in managing insects, better than the calendar. Because even though, we talk about shifts in climate, and the beauty of growing degree days is that it actually counts and it gets to a threshold. And that threshold is typically when we see something. It might vary a little bit in the calendar, but it's the growing degree day stuff. That's what makes seeds germinate. That's what makes insects germinate. That's also what makes bees buzz. So it's all that. Wonderful tool. If you're not familiar with it, it might really help you out. But we did want to focus today on, I know it's a little out of season, but it's just a nice thing to know and to talk about and to think about, especially as we're getting closer to spring, even though it's still far away.
Well, I think that, winter is a good time to think about this because winter's when you make all your plans for next year, right? So that's when you have your seed catalogs out and you're picking out what crops you're going to grow, and you're getting your growing schedule laid out so that you know what rotations to make, and et cetera, et cetera. So if you are, it's a really good time to step back and think about, okay, what are some things that I'd like to improve on? And what are some things that I haven't considered before? Like, for a lot of us, it's really hard to think of fungicides affecting insects, right? You would think that you would have to have an insecticide to affect an insect, but depending on the chemical at hand, you may have something that is going to impact the bees when they're coming out to pollinate your plants and give you lovely fruits.
That's right. And a lot of that isn't just active ingredients. We talk about active ingredients, which is the chemical that does what it's supposed to do in a pesticide. Whether it's a fungicide, insecticide, or herbicide, the active ingredient is what gives it that quality. But there are other things. There are inert ingredients that can be a preservative. There's different formulation types like liquids and granules and suspensions and emulsions, all kinds of things. And a lot of times it's not a direct effect on the bee or the insect, but it's that and those inert chemicals in there that might have an effect. Typically, when we're talking about very acute toxic chemicals to bees, that list is essentially 99% insecticides. And don't quote me that percentage, but but like the stuff that will really kill a bee quickly will more than likely be an insecticide. Not to say that other things have no effect on bees. And I think that's what Karen was getting at here.
Right. And so we're going to discuss a little bit of the non-insecticides that do affect bees, and we're going to talk a little bit about insecticides that are safer or less toxic to bees, and application techniques that are going to help you ensure you are protecting the bees.
That's right. And when we talk about bees, there's so many different types of bees. Well, first off, let's back up one step further, and then you have pollinators. For pollinators, we're talking about butterflies, bees, flies, beetles, birds, bats, wind, even though wind doesn't count. But there's all kinds of biological pollinators out there. When we talk about bees, there's more than just the good old honeybee.
That's right.
There's a whole bunch of bees.
There's 3,500 other species of bees living in North America. So that's just North America, 3,500 species of bees, and that's not counting the honeybee. All right? Because the honeybee is not native.
The honeybee gets all the credit.
It does.
But it's not just the honeybee. You have all kinds of bees doing all kinds of things, pollinating different types of, sometimes it is very specific, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
But we need to protect all of them. And one of the ways we can do that is through a process called integrated pest management. So when you do integrated pest management, we've talked about this several times, but we're talking about cultural practices. We're talking about scouting. We're talking about biological controls, if that is possible. Not always possible, but we're talking about doing things in a way that you're not just blindly throwing chemicals out. It's integrated pest management, so it applies cultural practices, mechanical practices too, spacing, even types of crops that you're growing all together, just everything that can affect the pests that you're after.
Right. And the main thing here is that the chemical should only be used when it's necessary and when it will be effective. So if your standard mode of action is to every 2 weeks throw Sevin dust all over your garden, you are not doing the world any favors, nor are you doing yourself any favors, because there are some insects that just doesn't work on. Colorado potato beetle is one of them. And so you don't want to do that to yourself, because there are a lot of other things that will work better and cause you less expense and keep your crop healthier and keep the environment healthier as well.
That's right. And a lot of times, even major agencies, to include Ohio Department of Agriculture, will say, when you're getting a pesticide license, usually using a pesticide is kind of a last resort thing, or at least it's not the first go-to. Just because you have the license and you know how to use it doesn't mean it's the best thing to throw out first. One, there's a cost aspect to it. There's a time aspect to it. And then there's an environmental and health risk that can come with that pesticide. Some are much worse than others, and some are essentially inert for mammals, but that doesn't mean that they don't have an environmental impact, and that doesn't mean that they don't have an off-target species impact. And today we're kind of talking about bee protection.
Right. And, even if you aren't going to use registered pesticides where you have to have a license, and even if you don't have to have the license for what you're doing, I really recommend at least taking the classes, because you learn about all sorts of really great things that will help you better control any pesticide you use, such as droplet size, coverage, different nozzle types. There's a lot of formulations out there, and mixing formulations can cause problems. And, learning about all of those ins and outs of using pesticides is really important. And there's a lot that goes on that talks about how you can not use a pesticide by simply watering early in the day or watering underneath the leaves. So you're only watering the roots, and that keeps your leaves drier. You're less likely to have different diseases taking hold. There's a lot of recommendations that are not specifically pesticide related, but will help you reduce your amount of pesticide. So I do recommend, if you ever have a pesticide class, like we have one coming up on the 20th at the library, and it's just to share different information about controlling different pests and how you can safely use chemicals in the garden.
So is this the 20th December?
20th of December, yeah, of 2022. I should probably specify that, huh?
Well, it's not that far off. And, there's another 20th in January.
This is true. This is true. Now, this is the 20th of December of 2022 for anyone who is listening to the podcast a couple of years down the road.
That's right. And then here in Belmont, we do a pesticide recertification, and we do host ODA to come and do pesticide certification classes as well, private and commercial.
And those are usually in March, right?
The recerts are typically in February, and the certifications I like to do in March.
Okay.
So hopefully, you've used some integrated pest management, you're scouting, and you've identified the insect, and you have a crop. Well, for one, pesticide labels are very specific, and you have to read them very carefully. A lot of times, when I was talking about the acute, very toxic active ingredients, you'll, like on the label itself, you will have a bee hazard warning on there, and it'll say, this product is toxic to bees. And there's a very precise timeline when you can apply it. There's a very precise window. Sometimes that window is more specific than others. For instance, if you are using something that has that kind of warning, please read and see when you can apply it. A lot of times you cannot apply it during foraging when the crop's in flower.
Right.
Because that's when the bees are actively going to the flower and collecting the pollen, and the pesticide is most fresh and has the most activity in it. Another thing is, depending on whether it has a long residual or how toxic it actually is to bees, which is different from toxicity to humans. So you got to think about this. Something that can kill a bee quickly doesn't necessarily harm humans directly. So using something that might not be as toxic to bees might still be toxic to you. So again, it's going to be on the label.
You choose the least toxic, least persistent pesticide whenever possible.
But there are things that have residual where it doesn't matter if you spray it outside the foraging window when the bees aren't actively going to the flowers and getting the pollen out and maybe drinking some nectar or whatever, because it's that active ingredient is active for weeks. And if that's the case, chances are it'll say on the label, do not use when crops in bloom at all. Or maybe you can't use it on that crop.
Right. Some crops continually bloom. Some crops bloom once and you get one crop out of that. And some crops, green beans, raspberries,
and non-determinate tomatoes.
Yes. They bloom continuously. And so you have to consider what you are growing and when it blooms when you're trying to consider how you're going to treat these pests.
Especially annuals. When they transition to reproductive, sometimes it just goes till the end of the season.
So what do you do if you do have a plant that's flowering that you need to do something to control a pest that's destroying it? Some of the things you can do is locate the nearby beehives, know where they are, make sure that you have a good buffer between beehives and your treatment area. There is a site called beecheck.org, beechek.org, beecheck.org, that can help you identify where local beehives are. There's also a drift warning site.
Well, if you call ODA, they can help you with all that because ODA typically regulates most of that stuff. So if you do have an apiary, call ODA, make sure it's registered because the label will say something like, please contact your Department of Agriculture or your registered site to make sure that there's no bees within X amount of miles around you. So if you don't register it, then it doesn't get identified and it can cause a problem. So it's not, I guess the government's tracking you, but in this case, it's to help you.
Right. Yeah. And, the other site I was thinking of is West Virginia or wvdriftwatch.org. So wv.driftwatch.org. And that is another site that you can go to and you can register what you're growing, especially if you're an organic grower or if you have bees. You can put your information in there to help make sure that your neighboring farm, who maybe has a pasture field and completely different management setup than organic vegetable farm. So it helps neighbors to be more neighborly.
And just because you're organic doesn't mean you're not using insecticides even. And some of those insecticides are not bee friendly. So be aware.
That's right. Like spinosad is a really common organic pesticide, insecticide, and it is very toxic to bees. So just because it's organic does not mean it is non-toxic. Okay.
to both bees and
right,
people.
Yes.
People as well.
It just means that it is from natural sources. It's not a synthetic copy of a naturally occurring, or it's not a lab created chemical.
And that is a misconception that we see and hear oftentimes. And it's just good to understand. And again, that label is going to tell you. That label is going to tell you if it's organic. It's going to tell you if it's toxic to you or to bees. It's going to tell you how you should apply it. It's going to reflect the law of that state at that time.
Right.
So make sure it's not too old. And if it is, then just be aware that the label might change a little bit. It usually doesn't change a lot. Sometimes it does, but try to make sure that you are doing things according to the current regulations too.
There are other things you can do, like applying pesticides at a time of day when bees aren't active. If you have something that is moderately toxic to bees with a short-term residual activity, you can apply it later in the evening when the bees have already gone home and gone to bed, and it gets sucked in by the plant or affect the other insects that you're trying to attack and not be available in the morning when the bees come back out. Because bees are daytime creatures. They don't fly at night, but there are some bees that sleep inside of flowers. So, there are things you have to consider about your crop and everything. But applying later in the day can help reduce the impact to bees.
And also, not only should you watch out for your crop in bloom, but think about the weeds around it.
Oh, yeah.
So if you're spraying something and it's not in bloom, but there's a bunch of in bloom dandelions everywhere, thistle, just your common weeds that are out there, and it seemed to be blooming at just about all the time. That's not true, but again, the weeds do have this array of times when they bloom, and if you're getting drift onto those weeds, you might be inadvertently killing the bees by spraying them directly when you shouldn't. So mow, mulch, watch for drift. Be aware. Just be aware of that stuff.
Yeah, mowing is a really great thing to talk about too, in that you're removing the heads of those flowers, so they're not attracting the bees anymore. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, keep your garden borders clean, right? All right, so now, all right, let's just jump into a few chemicals here. So some examples of low toxicity to bees, and so it has minimal bee precautions. Not to say it doesn't have any, but it has minimal. BT was one example that I kind of wanted to talk about. So Bacillus thuringiensis, it's an insecticide. BT is something that will kill moth-type caterpillars. Those are typically borers. It's very toxic to caterpillars, but it's very inert with bees. So even bee larvae isn't affected by BT directly. They've done a lot of experiments on this. They've done direct feedings. They've done field studies. But BT is kind of a safer insecticide to kill borer type insects, moth type caterpillars. We talk about BT corn, right? And the BT corn is going to have BT pollen, and the larvae is going to eat it, but it doesn't affect them. So anyway, it is in the low toxicity to bees. So that's an example of an insecticide. This is also where you see a lot of the common herbicides that we use: dicamba, diquat, some herbicides, right? If you're thinking it's going to kill plants, it's not going to kill insects, but it doesn't mean it won't have an effect on bees, even if it's minor. So a lot of times we talk about formulations. So in the case of dicamba, it'll say do not apply directly to water or where surface water is present. A lot of these herbicides also are deactivated by organic matter. So if you spray them when it's wet and it starts pooling, so one of the precautions with dicamba is do not apply directly to water or where surface water is present. So don't, typically on the label it'll say it anyway, don't spray when it's raining or don't spray when everything's still wet.
Right. So if you're trying to decide which herbicide you're going to use to maintain a fence row or something like that, and you're debating between, say, dicamba or 2,4-D, and you want to make sure that you're being extra cautious for bees, then dicamba would be the one you would want to lean towards. And 2,4-D, it's moderately toxic, and so you can protect the bees through your other management techniques. But I would go for the less toxic version around any type of hive or anything like that.
So let's go ahead and jump to the highly toxic to bee category. So these are going to have medium to long residuals too, a lot of times. And for this category, do not apply to plants that are flowering, period. Do not allow to drift on nearby flowering plants or weeds, which we talked about. And do not allow insecticide to contaminate water that is accessible to bees, including puddles. So bees like puddles too, which is kind of where we were talking about earlier.
And that can include puddling water from your irrigation system.
That's right. So things like bifenthrin, carbaryls. So you mentioned 7, right? There's your carbaryl. Very toxic to bees, very inert to mammals. Carbaryl is also toxic to aquatic invertebrates, reptiles, and earthworms as well. But that's an example of one that's very toxic to bees, but it won't really hurt your dog. But, obviously don't follow the label and don't feed it to your dog either.
Yeah, that's not recommended. But even some, like some of our systemic insecticides, like imidacloprid, one we use a lot when we were trying to deal with emerald ash borer, because it's systemic. It goes through the circulatory system of the plant, and it can persist in nectar and pollen. And so imidacloprid is one of the neonicotinoids, and that should tell you a little bit something about nicotine here, that it is highly toxic to bees. So you have to be really careful about timing when you're using imidacloprid. And it also has a persistent effect in the plant. So we're leaning away from that for treating spotted lanternfly, but keep in mind systemic effects can sometimes persist in nectar and pollen as well.
Right. And so that's why we have to be very careful with plants that are in bloom or plants that are going to be in bloom during that residual period as well.
Yeah.
So not to say these don't have a place, but these are very specific in that you cannot apply during flowering, and you cannot apply when there's possibility of drift onto flowers as well. So just be very cautious. Watch what you're trying to kill. Is there a better option? And is it okay to spray it at this point? Sometimes there are very good circumstances to use carbaryl, bifenthrin, imidacloprid, malathion, permethrin, but it's very specific, and there's a place for it, and there's a very bad time to do it.
Yeah.
So
yeah, for sure.
Be aware of that. Read that label, and just think about your neighborhood bees, your friends.
Before we run out of time, I did want to make a note about a fungicide that a lot of orchard growers use called Captan. And it is a very effective and useful fungicide in orchard and fruit production. But it does have a insecticide impact sometimes, or not sometimes, but it does have a little bit of an insecticide impact. So if you are using Captan, then you need to also be aware of flowering times and make sure that you're using it prior to bud break, because it can be mildly toxic to bees. It is one of the moderately toxic to bees. And I do want to direct everyone to a really great publication from Ohio State Extension called Protecting Pollinators While Using Pesticides. It is posted online. It's fact sheet ANR-68 by Helen M. Andrews and Mary Ann Rose. And it's a great review of all of the things that we talked about today. It goes into a lot more depth if you really want to know more. And I do recommend checking it out. Again, it's Protecting Pollinators While Using Pesticides by Helen M. Andrews and Mary Ann Rose. And it is available through OhioLineOSU.edu in their fact sheet section. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.